Most people believe overthinking is a sign of intelligence. They wear it like a badge. They say things like, I just think deeply, or I analyze everything. But if we're being honest, most overthinking has nothing to do with depth. It's not intelligence. It's mismanaged attention. The top 1% understand something most people miss. Thinking is a tool, not a lifestyle. When thought becomes constant, unfocused, and repetitive, it stops serving you. It turns into mental noise. And noise, no matter how complex it sounds, reduces clarity. Overthinking feels productive because the mind is busy. Activity is mistaken for progress. But activity without direction is just friction. You can spin a wheel endlessly and still go nowhere. That's what overthinking looks like internally, motion without movement. Psychologically, overthinking is the mind searching for certainty where none exists. The brain is designed to solve problems, but when a problem has no clear solution, the mind doesn't stop. It loops. It revisits the same variables, the same fears, the same imagined outcomes. Not because it's effective, but because uncertainty feels threatening. The mind would rather exhaust itself than sit with not knowing. High-level thinkers don't eliminate uncertainty. They tolerate it. This is a critical distinction. Intelligence isn't the absence of doubt. It's the ability to function despite doubt. The top 1% don't wait for perfect clarity before acting. They recognize that clarity often comes after movement, not before it. Stoic philosophy aligns with this completely. Marcus Aurelius warned against unnecessary mental complexity. He reminded himself to strip away the unnecessary and return to what was essential. Overthinking adds layers. Elite thinking removes them. The mind has limited cognitive bandwidth. When it's flooded with hypothetical scenarios, imagined judgments, and future catastrophes, it loses the capacity to respond effectively in the present. Overthinking is not deep thinking, it's undisciplined thinking. There's also an emotional component that often goes unacknowledged. Overthinking is usually fear in disguise, fear of failure, fear of judgment, fear of making the wrong choice. The mind masks this fear with analysis because analysis feels safer than action. If you're still thinking, you haven't failed yet, you haven't risked anything, but avoidance always has a cost. The top 1% recognize that thinking has diminishing returns. Past a certain point, more analysis does not produce better decisions. It produces paralysis. This is why elite performers train decisiveness as a skill. They set mental boundaries around thinking. They decide how long analysis is allowed and then they move. This is not recklessness. It's efficiency. Modern neuroscience supports this. The brain's default mode network, the system active during rumination and overthinking, consumes enormous energy without producing tangible output. Meanwhile, action-oriented networks quiet the mind. Movement reorganizes cognition. Overthinking thrives in stillness. Clarity thrives in engagement. This is why overthinking often increases when you're tired, isolated, or idle. The mind turns inward with nothing external to anchor it. Without structure, attention scatters. Elite minds create structure deliberately. They don't let the mind wander endlessly. Another mistake people make is confusing complexity with sophistication. Simple thoughts executed well outperform. Complex thoughts executed never. The top 1% simplify aggressively. They ask what matters, what's controllable, what's the next step. Everything else is discarded. This takes discipline. The mind resists simplicity because simplicity feels exposed. If the solution is simple, there's nowhere to hide. Overthinking provides cover. It delays responsibility. Stoicism cuts through that delay. It teaches that unnecessary thought is a form of self-indulgence, not because thinking is bad, but because excess thinking without action erodes character. You become someone who contemplates rather than commits, and once that identity forms, it reinforces itself. You begin to see yourself as the thinker, not the actor. The top 1% refuse that identity trap. They think when thinking is required. They act when action is required. They rest when rest is required. No overlap, no confusion. This is the foundation for stopping overthinking. You don't try to silence the mind. You give it a job. You direct attention toward decision, execution, and feedback. When the mind is properly employed, it stops turning on itself. Overthinking isn't depth. It's drift. Train your attention, or it will train your anxiety. Once you accept that overthinking is mismanaged attention, the next skill becomes obvious and non-negotiable. You must learn to separate signal from noise. This is where the top 1% quietly dominate, not by knowing more, but by ignoring more. Most people assume clarity comes from gathering information, more opinions, more research, more scenarios, more thinking. But the mind doesn't drown from lack of knowledge. It drowns from excess input. When everything feels important, nothing is actionable. Overthinking thrives in environments where relevance is never questioned. Elite minds are ruthless filters. They understand that not every thought deserves attention, and not every piece of information deserves consideration. The brain produces thousands of thoughts per day, most of them repetitive, emotionally charged, and strategically useless. Treating all of them as meaningful is like responding to every notification on your phone while trying to make a critical decision. You're not being thorough, you're being distracted. Stoicism addressed this directly. Epictetus warned against letting impressions rush the mind unchecked. His instruction was simple but demanding: pause, examine, and decide whether an impression is worth engaging. If it's not within your control, not actionable, or not relevant to your values, it doesn't get access. That's not ignorance, that's discipline. Noise is anything that does not change your next decision. This is where most overthinkers struggle. They confuse possibility with probability. They obsess over what could happen rather than what is likely, and more importantly, what is actionable. The mind becomes occupied with hypotheticals that have no direct influence on behavior. Anxiety feeds on that gap. Top performers close the gap aggressively. They ask sharper questions. Does this affect my next move? Is this information reliable? Is this something I can act on right now? If the answer is no, it's dismissed, not argued with, not explored, dismissed. This takes restraint. Noise is seductive. It feels responsible to consider everything. It feels intelligent to anticipate every outcome, but anticipation without discrimination becomes paranoia. The Stoics understood that wisdom is not knowing many things, it's knowing what to ignore. Modern psychology calls this attentional control, the ability to direct focus deliberately rather than reflexively. People with strong attentional control experience less anxiety, make faster decisions, and recover more quickly from stress. Not because their lives are easier, but because their minds are quieter. And quiet minds see clearly. There's another layer here that matters. Noise is often emotional in disguise. Rumination feels like problem solving, but it's usually fear rehearsing itself. Worry feels like preparation, but it rarely leads to action. When you label emotional noise as thinking, you give it legitimacy. When you recognize it as noise, it loses authority. Elite thinkers are not calmer by nature. They are selective by training. They understand that attention is finite. Every moment spent on irrelevant thought is energy stolen from execution. This is why high performers often appear blunt or decisive. They are not ignoring complexity. They are prioritizing relevance. This applies not just internally but externally. Opinions are noise. Trends are noise. Most news is noise. Social comparison is noise. The top 1% limit exposure not because they are uninformed, but because they are intentional. They protect cognitive bandwidth the same way others protect money or time. And this isn't about isolation. It's about hierarchy. Information must earn its place. If it doesn't inform action, improve judgment, or sharpen skill, it doesn't stay. Stoicism reinforces this by anchoring attention to the present task. Marcus Aurelius repeatedly reminded himself to do what was in front of him well, without being pulled by anticipation or distraction. That focus is not passive, it's aggressive. It requires saying no internally dozens of times per day. This is where overthinking starts to dissolve. Not because the mind stops producing noise, but because you stop amplifying it. You stop feeding every thought with curiosity or concern. You reserve attention for signal. And signal is usually simple: a choice, a step, a correction, a conversation. Overthinkers search for certainty. Elite minds search for leverage. What small action reduces uncertainty? What decision moves this forward? That question cuts through noise instantly. Over time, this changes your relationship with thought itself. You stop identifying with every idea that passes through your mind. Thoughts become tools, not truths. You don't chase them, you evaluate them. That evaluation is calm, fast, and unemotional. This is not suppression. It's prioritization. And when prioritization becomes habit, overthinking loses its oxygen. The mind stays engaged but no longer scattered. Focus replaces fixation. Clarity replaces complexity. Noise demands attention. Signal demands action. Learn the difference. And your mind will finally work for you, not against you. Once you've learned to recognize overthinking as misdirected attention, and once you've trained yourself to filter signal from noise, the next move becomes unavoidable. You must decide faster and correct sooner. This is where most people freeze, because they've been conditioned to believe that good decisions come from perfect information. They don't. They come from movement. Overthinking survives on delay. As long as a decision hasn't been made, the mind feels temporarily safe. No consequences yet, no risk yet, no responsibility yet. But that safety is an illusion, and it's expensive. Indecision doesn't remove pressure, it compounds it. The longer you wait, the heavier the decision feels, and the louder the mental noise becomes. The top 1% understand something most people resist. Hesitation is not caution. It's often disguised fear. Stoicism was brutally honest about this. The Stoics believed that life is action-oriented by nature. To refuse to act when action is required is not neutrality. It's a choice to be carried by circumstances rather than to shape them. Marcus Aurelius warned against wasting time arguing about what a good man should be instead of being one. In modern terms, thinking endlessly about decisions is often a way of avoiding becoming responsible for the outcome. Elite minds reverse this pattern. They do not wait for certainty. They work with probabilities. They make the best decision available with the information they have, then move. And here's the critical part. They expect to adjust. This is where most overthinkers go wrong. They believe a decision must be correct from the start. Top performers believe decisions must be correctable. That single shift removes enormous pressure from the mind. When you know you can course correct, action becomes less threatening. Psychologically, action reorganizes the brain. When you decide and move, uncertainty collapses into feedback. Feedback is concrete. It's manageable. Rumination, on the other hand, keeps uncertainty abstract, and abstract threats feel endless. This is why action reduces anxiety faster than reassurance ever could. Think about it. When you're stuck in your head, every option feels equally risky. But once you choose one, reality responds. You learn. You gather real data instead of imagined outcomes. Even if the decision was imperfect, you're no longer guessing. You're adjusting. The Stoics trained this deliberately. They believe that errors are not moral failures. They are instructional. Seneca wrote that no one becomes wise without making mistakes. The danger is not error, the danger is paralysis. Top 1% thinkers build speed not because they're reckless, but because they understand the cost of delay. While others are still debating, internally, they are already on their second or third iteration. They don't identify with being right, they identify with being effective. This mindset also collapses overthinking because it removes the fantasy of the perfect outcome. Perfectionism feeds indecision. Stoicism destroys perfectionism by reminding you that outcomes are never fully under your control anyway. What is under your control is effort, intention, and adjustment. And here's the paradox. Faster decisions often lead to better outcomes, not because the decisions are smarter, but because the mind stays clear. When you overthink, emotion contaminates judgment. Fear, ego, and imagined consequences pile on. When you decide earlier, the decision is cleaner. This doesn't mean impulsivity, it means decisiveness with humility. You act knowing you may need to revise. That humility is what allows correction without ego collapse. Correction is where growth happens. Elite minds are not attached to their decisions. They are attached to progress. If something isn't working, they change it quickly. Overthinkers, on the other hand, cling to decisions because so much mental energy went into making them. Admitting error feels costly, so they hesitate longer next time. Stoicism short-circuits this cycle. It teaches that being wrong is not an identity threat. It's a natural part of operating in an uncertain world. The faster you accept that, the lighter decisions become. This also connects directly to emotional regulation. Indecision creates anxiety because the mind is holding unresolved tension. Decisions release tension. Even difficult decisions bring relief because the mind prefers a hard reality to endless speculation. This is why high-pressure professionals, surgeons, commanders, pilots, are trained to decide under uncertainty. Not because they enjoy risk, but because delay is more dangerous than action. Stoicism trains the same muscle in everyday life. You don't need more time to think. You need a bias toward action. When you act, you shift from imagining outcomes to shaping them. You stop rehearsing failure and start collecting evidence. You move from anxiety to agency. Overthinking wants guarantees. The top 1% work with momentum. Decide, move, adjust. Clarity follows action, not the other way around. Once decisions start happening faster and correction becomes normal, the real source of overthinking reveals itself. It's not the world, it's not complexity, it's the constant, unchecked narration running in your head. Overthinking is rarely about the problem in front of you. It's about the story you keep telling yourself about the problem. If you want to train your mind like the top 1%, you have to take control of that narrative. Most people live inside a stream of internal commentary they never question. The mind predicts failure, exaggerates consequences, imagines judgment, and fills in gaps with worst-case scenarios. It sounds intelligent because it's articulate. It sounds responsible because it's cautious. But it's neither. It's undisciplined. Stoicism treats the inner narrative as a battleground. Marcus Aurelius wrote to himself constantly because he knew that if he didn't shape his own thinking, it would shape him. He didn't argue with the world. He corrected his interpretations of it. That distinction matters. Modern psychology confirms this. Overthinking is fueled by cognitive distortions, catastrophizing, mind reading, all or nothing thinking, emotional reasoning. These are not deep insights. They are mental shortcuts that amplify anxiety. Left unchecked, they become the default lens through which you interpret reality. The top 1% do not eliminate this voice. They regulate it. The first step is recognizing that the inner narrative is not truth, it's interpretation. A thought like this could go wrong is not a warning from reality. It's a hypothesis from the mind. When you treat hypotheses as facts, anxiety becomes inevitable. Elite thinkers interrogate their thoughts, not emotionally, logically. Is this assumption based on evidence or fear? Is this worst-case scenario likely or merely possible? Does this story help me decide, or does it only make me hesitate? If the answer is hesitation, the thought is neutralized. Neutralization doesn't mean positive thinking. Stoicism rejects that completely. It replaces distortion with precision. Instead of "this will be a disaster," the inner narrative becomes "there is risk, and I can manage it." Instead of "I'm not ready," it becomes "I will adjust as I go." These aren't affirmations, they're recalibrations. And recalibration changes behavior. When the inner voice is exaggerated, emotions spike. Fear feels urgent, doubt feels permanent. But when the narrative is factual and contained, emotions settle. The nervous system responds to language. Catastrophic language creates stress. Measured language creates control. This is why elite performers sound different internally. They're self-taught. LK is short, direct, and unemotional. They don't narrate every possibility. They issue commands. Focus on the next step. Handle what's in front of you. Correct and continue. This is not bravado. It's efficiency. Overthinking thrives on storytelling. The mind spins narratives about how things could unfold, how others might react, how failure would feel. These stories feel real because they are detailed, but detail does not equal truth. The Stoics warned against being seduced by vivid impressions. The more dramatic the thought, the more suspicious you should be. This also explains why overthinking intensifies at night or in isolation. Without external structure, the mind turns inward and amplifies its own voice. Elite minds counter this by anchoring attention to action. When you are engaged, the narrative quiets. When you are idle, it grows louder. But control doesn't come from distraction, it comes from authorship. You decide what language is allowed in your mind. You decide how events are framed. That's not suppression, that's leadership. This practice also builds emotional resilience. When setbacks occur, the inner narrative determines whether you spiral or stabilize. This proves I'm incompetent creates collapse. This shows what needs adjustment creates momentum. Same event, different narration, completely different outcome. Stoicism trains this relentlessly. You remind yourself that events are neutral. Meaning is added by judgment. Change the judgment, and you change the experience. This is not denial, it's power. And here's what most people don't realize. The inner narrative shapes identity over time. The stories you tell yourself repeatedly become the person you believe you are. Overthinkers often identify as cautious, anxious, or uncertain because that's the language they hear daily. Elite thinkers identify as adaptable, decisive, and resilient because that's how they speak internally. Identity follows language. This is why controlling the inner narrative is not optional, it's foundational. You cannot stop overthinking if you let every thought run unchecked. You cannot act decisively if your internal voice is constantly undermining you. The mind must have a clear chain of command. So the rule is simple but demanding. Thoughts must earn their place. If they clarify action, they stay. If they magnify fear, they go. Your mind is listening to you. Speak like someone in control or be ruled by the noise. Once you begin to control the inner narrative, another uncomfortable truth becomes obvious. Most overthinking is not caused by a lack of clarity, but by an excess of input. The mind cannot think clearly when it is constantly being fed. And the top 1% understand this at a level most people never reach. They deliberately limit what enters their mental environment. Overthinking is often blamed on personality. In reality, it's environmental. Too many opinions, too much information, too many perspectives competing for attention. The modern mind is rarely quiet, not because it's complex, but because it's overloaded. The brain was not designed to process infinite input. It was designed to solve immediate problems, make decisions, and move forward. When you flood it with news cycles, social comparisons, notifications, endless content, and other people's emotional reactions, it doesn't become smarter. It becomes fragmented. Fragmentation creates overthinking. Stoicism addressed this long before smartphones and social media existed. The Stoics warned against mental clutter. They emphasized simplicity not as an aesthetic, but as a psychological necessity. Marcus Aurelius repeatedly reminded himself to return to what was essential and discard the rest. Not because the rest was evil, but because it was distracting. The top 1% apply the same principle today. They treat attention like a scarce resource. Not everything is allowed access. Not every opinion is considered. Not every update is consumed. They understand that clarity requires subtraction. Most people do the opposite. When they feel uncertain, they add more input, more research, more advice, more comparison. But uncertainty doesn't shrink under excess, it expands. Each new input introduces new variables, new doubts, new possibilities to consider. Overthinking accelerates. Elite thinkers reverse the instinct. When the mind feels cluttered, they reduce, they step back, they remove inputs until signal becomes visible again. Psychological. This works because attention stabilizes when it's not constantly redirected. Every time your focus shifts, the brain pays a cost. Cognitive switching drains energy and increases mental fatigue. Fatigued minds overthink more, not less. They lose the ability to prioritize. This is why people overthink most when they're mentally exhausted. Limiting inputs is not about ignorance, it's about hierarchy. The top 1% decide in advance what deserves their attention. They don't wait to feel overwhelmed before setting boundaries. They build systems that protect mental clarity by default. This shows up in small but powerful ways. Fewer sources of information, fewer people consulted, fewer platforms engaged with, fewer opinions invited, not because they believe they're always right, but because they understand that too many voices dilute decision-making. Stoicism reinforces this by anchoring focus to the present responsibility. What is required of me right now? Not what everyone thinks, not what might happen months from now. What action is mine in this moment? That question automatically filters input. There's also an emotional angle most people miss. Many inputs are emotionally charged. News, social media, commentary, they are designed to provoke reaction, not clarity. When you consume emotionally loaded content, your nervous system stays activated. An activated nervous system cannot think cleanly. It scans for threat. It anticipates problems that may never arrive. Overthinking feeds on that state. Elite minds understand that calm is not passive, it's engineered. They create conditions where the mind can settle. Silence is part of that. So is solitude. So is boredom. When inputs decrease, the mind reorganizes. Thoughts slow down. Priorities emerge naturally. This is why some of the clearest insights come during walks, showers, or quiet moments. Not because you're thinking harder, but because you've stopped feeding the noise. The signal was always there. It was just buried. Limiting inputs also forces you to rely on your own judgment. This can feel uncomfortable at first. External opinions provide reassurance. They diffuse responsibility. When you reduce them, decisions feel heavier. But that weight is necessary. It builds confidence. You learn to trust your reasoning, and trust reduces overthinking. The top 1% don't outsource clarity. They refine it internally. They seek information strategically, not compulsively. When they have enough to act, they stop. They don't chase certainty. They chase sufficiency. This also explains why elite performers often appear detached from trends. They're not reactive. They are selective. While others are mentally scattered, they are mentally concentrated. That concentration compounds over time. Stoicism frames this as self-command. If you cannot control what enters your mind, you cannot control what leaves it. Inputs shape thoughts, thoughts shape decisions, decisions shape life. The chain stop RTS at the gate. So the discipline is simple, but demanding. Fewer inputs, deeper focus, less noise, more execution. Fewer opinions, stronger judgment. Overthinking is not cured by thinking better. It's cured by feeding the mind less. Protect your attention like your future depends on it, because it does. Once mental inputs are reduced and clarity begins to return, a new danger appears: choice. Too many people assume that freedom comes from having unlimited options in every moment. In reality, unlimited choice is one of the fastest ways to trigger overthinking. This is where the top 1% separate themselves completely. They don't rely on motivation, mood, or momentary clarity. They build execution rituals. Rituals eliminate negotiation. Most overthinking happens right before action. The mind starts asking unnecessary questions. Should I do this now? What if I wait? What's the best way? These questions feel responsible, but they often exist to delay discomfort. The brain is looking for an escape route, not a better strategy. Stoicism anticipated this weakness. The Stoics did not trust the emotional state of the moment. They assumed the mind would resist effort, discipline, and discomfort. So instead of arguing with themselves every day, they removed the argument entirely. They decided in advance. That is the essence of ritual. A ritual is a pre-committed behavior that triggers action regardless of how you feel. You don't wake up and debate whether to reflect. You reflect. You don't decide when to train. You train at a fixed time. You don't wonder whether to start. You start because that's what happens next. From a psychological perspective, this is powerful because it bypasses the decision-making center of the brain. Decision fatigue is real. Every choice drains cognitive energy. Overthinkers burn most of their energy deciding whether to act instead of acting. Elite minds remove that drain. They systematize behavior so the mind can stay quiet. When action is automated, anxiety drops. Overthinking loses its foothold because there's nothing to analyze. The path is already chosen. This is why top performers often look boring from the outside. Their routines are repetitive, their habits are predictable, but that predictability is precisely what creates mental freedom. While others are burning energy deciding what to do, elite minds are already executing. Stoicism frames this as alignment with reason. Reason does not fluctuate. Emotion does. If you allow emotion to decide behavior, your life becomes inconsistent. Ritual anchors behavior to principle instead of feeling, and this matters more than motivation ever will. Motivation is unreliable. It comes and goes, it spikes and crashes. If your productivity depends on feeling motivated, overthinking will dominate your downtime. You'll wait for the right mood. You'll analyze readiness. You'll hesitate. Ritual makes readiness irrelevant. There's another subtle benefit here. Rituals create momentum. Once you start moving, the mind follows. Action quiets thought. Execution grounds attention. Overthinking thrives in anticipation. It dissolves in motion. This is why the top 1% focus obsessively on starting rituals. The first 5 minutes, the opening move, the non-negotiable trigger. They know that once the system is engaged, resistance drops. Stoics practice this through daily structure: morning reflection, evening review, scheduled labor, scheduled rest. not because structure was rigid, but because it protected clarity. Structure contains chaos. And notice something important: rituals are not complex. Complexity invites debate. Simplicity invites compliance. The simpler the ritual, the harder it is for the mind to argue with it. Sit, write one sentence. Stand up, take the first step, open the document, begin. That's it. Overthinkers love elaborate systems because elaborate systems allow endless optimization. Rituals are intentionally blunt. They trade elegance for reliability. This also builds trust with yourself. When you consistently act without negotiation, the mind learns that hesitation is unnecessary. Confidence grows not from success alone, but from consistency. You stop asking, "Will I do this?" You already know the answer. And that knowledge is calming. Ritual also limits emotional volatility. When behavior is stable, emotions adjust around it. You don't need to feel focused to work. You work and focus follows. You don't need to feel confident to act. You act and confidence builds. Stoicism understood this inversion clearly. You don't wait to feel virtuous. You behave virtuously until the feeling aligns. This principle connects directly to everything that came before. You cannot filter signal from noise if your behavior is reactive. You cannot decide faster if you reopen decisions every day. You cannot control the inner narrative if action is optional. Ritual removes optionality, and that's the point. Overthinking feeds on open loops. Ritual closes them. When action becomes automatic, the mind finally rests, not because there's nothing to do, but because it knows what happens next. Build systems that carry you when thinking would slow you down. When behavior is structured, the mind becomes quiet, and quiet minds execute. When execution becomes ritual and action no longer depends on mood, the final source of overthinking comes into focus. It's subtle, and it's deeply ingrained: obsession with outcomes. The mind keeps projecting forward, measuring success before the work is finished, imagining consequences before they arrive. And that projection pulls attention out of the present, where all effective action actually happens. The top 1% break this pattern by shifting from outcome obsession to process mastery. Most people think overthinking is about uncertainty. It's not. It's about attachment. When your identity is tied to results, winning, approval, recognition, avoiding failure, the mind becomes hypervigilant. Every action feels heavy because it carries imagined consequences. Pressure builds before anything even happens. Stoicism dismantles this by drawing a hard line between effort and outcome. Effort is yours. Outcome is not. You can influence results, but you can never command them. When you forget this, the mind tries to control the future through thought. That's overthinking in its purest form. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself constantly, "Do the task in front of you with excellence and let the rest unfold." Not as resignation, but as discipline. The present moment is the only point of leverage you have. Anything beyond it is speculation. Elite performers internalize this. They don't ignore goals, but they don't live inside them either. Goals set direction. Process drives execution. When process is solid, outcomes take care of themselves more often than not. Psychologically, this shift is stabilizing. The brain experiences less threat because success is no longer defined by variables it cannot control. Anxiety drops because attention stays anchored to action, not projection. You stop rehearsing failure and start practicing skill. This also changes how you respond to mistakes. When outcomes are everything, mistakes feel catastrophic. When process is central, mistakes become feedback, data, something to refine. Overthinking feeds on emotional interpretation. Process thinking replaces interpretation with adjustment. The Stoics were relentless about this. They believed excellence was a byproduct of correct action repeated over time, not a single perfect performance. That belief removes urgency. It creates patience. It allows consistency. There's a reason elite athletes, operators, and high-level professionals focus on routines rather than results under pressure. When the stakes are high, thinking about the outcome degrades performance. The mind tightens, movements become forced, errors increase, but when attention stays on execution, breathing, mechanics, sequence, the body performs. The same principle applies to thinking itself. Overthinking collapses when the mind has a clear, immediate task, not a future scenario, not a hypothetical evaluation, a concrete process step. What do I do next? What is within my control right now? That question ends mental wandering instantly. This doesn't mean you abandon ambition. It means you respect time. You recognize that mastery is built incrementally. The top 1% are patient because they are process-oriented. They trust the system they've built, and this trust is earned. It comes from repetition, from showing up, from doing the work regardless of emotional weather. When you trust your process, you don't need to obsess over results. You already know what you do when it's time to perform. This also creates emotional resilience. Wins don't inflate the ego. Losses don't destroy it. Identity remains stable because it's rooted in behavior, not outcomes. That stability is what allows sustained performance. Stoicism frames this as dignity and effort. You measure yourself by how you act, not by how things turn out. That standard is liberating. It gives you full ownership of your life without demanding control over the uncontrollable. And here's the final integration. Overthinking is what happens when the mind tries to live in the future. Process mastery forces it back into the present. Signal replaces speculation. Action replaces anxiety. When you commit to process, the mind quiets because it knows its role. It stops trying to predict. It starts executing. That's what it means to train your mind like the top 1%. Not to think less, but to think in service of action. Focus on the process. Execute with precision. Let results arrive on their own schedule. Clarity lies where action is.